Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
A new meal plan is being offered by the college. Read the plan in the college newspaper, printed on page 60. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now.
The adjustment knobs. The larger one for and that's magnificate 1000.
Number 6. Listen to part of a talk. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a talk in a biology laboratory. The teaching assistant is explaining how to use the microscope.
All right, now that you all have microscopes at your tables, I want to explain how they work and how to use them. First of all, you should know that they are compound microscopes, so they can magnify objects up to 1,000 times their size. These microscopes have two systems, an illuminating system and an imaging system. You'll see that the illuminating system has a light source built in, and you can control it by adjusting the lever on the side. Why is this important? Well, the specimen must be pretty thin, or let's say transparent enough to let light pass.
Activity 7. Listen to the beginning of a lecture in a linguistics class.
Good morning. Well, we have a lot to do today, so let's get going. If you're caught up with your reading assignment. Good morning. Well, we have a lot to do today, so let's get going. If you're caught up with your reading assignments, you've already read the article on the 3 types of language. But before we go on with the discussion, I want to take a few minutes to compare them. Okay, standard language first. That's language that's comprehended, used, and considered acceptable by most speakers. I mean, native speakers. So definitions of words and phrases in standard language, they're found in the dictionary. They can be used in both formal and informal situations, settings, and this is important. Standard language is appropriate in both speech and writing. I'd say that all of these characteristics combine to make standard language. Well, let's just say that it's the permanent core of the language. That brings us to colloquial language, which is included in dictionaries, but colloquial language is marked, and usually it's a colloquial idiom. So these patterns of colloquial language are understood and used and accepted in informal exchanges, and people use them in informal situations, but they're not really considered appropriate in formal settings. Did I say that colloquial language is more prevalent in speech than in writing? That's important. And the key point in the article was that colloquial language becomes so much part of the culture that at some point it often evolves into standard language. So you can compare an earlier dictionary with a recent dictionary, and that will, you can see how some phrases that are marked as colloquial language lose that designation in later editions of the same dictionary. Okay, so you can see that colloquial idioms last a long time, either remaining popular in colloquial speech, or as I said, it can evolve into standard language and become a permanent part of the language. But that's very different from slang expressions because, and this is the key point, Slang is usually a temporary phenomenon. It's used by some speakers or groups in informal situations, and they're much more common in speech than they are in writing. Sometimes they're included in a dictionary, but they're always clearly marked as slang. And when you check later editions of the dictionary, quite often the slang expression is no longer included because it's out of style. Now, let's consider the three types of language together, and I want you to think of them on a continuum from most to least formal. So, if we do that, colloquial language would have to go between standard and slang. So, the slang is often relegated to a temporary fad, and standard language contains the stable elements of the language, and colloquial language has the potential to become a permanent part of the language. But it might not. I think it's interesting that most native speakers will use all three types of language, and they'll use them all appropriately without thinking about it. In fact, only a few speakers will be able to analyze their speech and writing using the labels that the author identified in the article. That said, let's get out the article for today's discussion and
つってやられちゃうなものを見る。
Activity 8. Listen to the beginning of a lecture in a sociology class as you read the transcript. The professor is discussing status and roles.
status refers to a position in society or in a group. But there are really two types of status: ascribed status and achieved status. Okay? In ascribed status, the status is automatic, so you don't have a choice. In other words, it's an involuntary status. And some examples that come to mind are status because of race or sex. Not much you can do about that. On the other hand, achieved status requires some effort and there's a choice involved. For instance, a marriage partner or the type of education, or for that matter, the length of time in school. Well, these are choices, achievements, and so they fall under the category of achieved status. So that brings us to the status set. A status set is the combination of all statuses that an individual has. Me, for example, I'm a professor, but I'm also a husband and a father and a son since my mother's still living. So in each of these statuses, I have certain behaviors that are expected because of the status. Okay, all of the behaviors are roles. I mean, a role is the behavior expected because of status. Okay, back to status set. All of the statuses, husband, father, son, professor, combine to form the status set. And each of the statuses have certain expectations. Let me use that professor status again. So, as a professor, I have a teaching role, and I have to prepare classes. That's expected. I also advise students, grade assignments, and evaluate my students. But this role is very different expectations. As a researcher, I have to design studies, raise funds for grants, and then perform the research. And finally, I write articles and reports. So I think you see what I mean. But one more thing, and this is important. Sometimes role conflict can occur. Let me say that again. Role conflict. And that means that meeting the expectations for one role will cause problems for an individual who's trying to meet other expectations in a different role. Okay, let's say that one of my students is dating my daughter. I don't recommend this. But anyway, I may have role strain that could even develop into role conflict because it will be difficult for me to meet the expectations for my role as teacher. And when the student comes to my house, I'll have to remember my status as father and my role that requires me to welcome a guest into my home. and, well, form an opinion about someone who wants to take my daughter out on a date. The textbook actually.
なんで尻切りトンボのやつばっか。まあいいけどさ。次は。